George H.W. Bush, the 41st U.S. President. George H.W. Bush wasn't just your average politician. By the time he ran for president in 1988, he'd already been a World War II hero, headed the CIA, and served as Reagan's right-hand man for 8 years. In other words, Bush had one of the most impressive political resumes in modern history. In 1988, after years of standing loyally by Reagan's side, it was Bush's turn to take center stage. But following Reagan, the man with movie star charm was no small feat. Imagine stepping into the spotlight after someone's already stolen the show. Bush knew he had big cowboy boots to fill. When Bush took office, it was like getting the keys to a car with a half-empty tank, a suspicious rattling noise, and a passenger seat full of Cold War baggage. Not exactly a Sunday drive, right? But before we dive into the historic events that defined his presidency, let's rewind to the 1988 election. After 8 years as Reagan's VP, Bush ran on the promise to continue the legacy of strength and diplomacy that had marked the Reagan era. Bush won the election in a landslide, proving that voters believed in his leadership. But what came next was even bigger. He was about to face one of the most dramatic shifts in global politics. And that brings us to our next chapter. The Cold War was ending, and George H.W. Bush was in the driver's seat. What role did he play in shaping the world as we know it today? Stick around to find out. When George H.W. Bush entered office, one of the biggest questions was how the Cold War would end. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in a tense standoff, but by 1989, the cracks in the Iron Curtain were starting to show. Bush wasn't just a spectator. He worked closely with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, navigating a delicate diplomatic dance that would soon lead to one of the most significant moments of the 20th century, the fall of the Berlin Wall. The world watched as the Berlin Wall crumbled, and with it, the division of East and West Germany. It was as if a giant "do not enter" sign had finally been taken down, and Bush played a key role in making sure the transition was peaceful. While many would say Bush was lucky to be president at such a historic moment, his steady hand and calm diplomacy helped ensure that the end of the Cold War didn't lead to chaos. Instead of celebrating a victory over the Soviets, Bush emphasized cooperation and the need to build a new world order. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed. After years of global tension, the Cold War was over, and Bush had overseen the peaceful dissolution of one of America's greatest adversaries. This was more than just a win for the United States. Bush's leadership helped set the stage for a new era of global relations, one where diplomacy, not arms races, would shape the future. But while Bush was securing peace abroad, trouble was brewing in another part of the world that would soon test his presidency. While George H.W. Bush was celebrating a victory for diplomacy in Europe, trouble was brewing in the Middle East. In August 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein launched a bold invasion of neighboring Kuwait, sending shock waves across the world. For President Bush, this wasn't just a local conflict. The invasion threatened global oil supplies and stability in the region. But Bush wasn't about to let Saddam rewrite the rules of international law on his watch. In true gather-the-team fashion, Bush rallied an international coalition of over 30 countries, kind of like assembling the Avengers, but with diplomats in suits instead of superheroes in capes. And yes, he made it clear to Saddam that the world wasn't going to sit back and watch. After months of diplomatic efforts and a firm UN resolution, Bush gave the green light for Operation Desert Storm in January 1991, a military campaign aimed at liberating Kuwait and sending a message that aggression would not stand. The air campaign was swift and overwhelming as coalition forces launched one of the most impressive military operations of modern times. In just 42 days, they drove Iraqi forces out of Kuwait and put an end to Saddam's occupation. Bush declared victory, and his approval ratings skyrocketed up to 89%. For a moment, it seemed like he was untouchable. The Gulf War was over, and Bush had shown the world that the U.S. was still the global peacekeeper. It was a textbook example of how to win a war quick, decisive, and with minimal casualties. If only all military campaigns could run as smoothly as Desert Storm, right? But while the war made Bush a hero abroad, things back home weren't looking so rosy. The economy was in trouble, and the next challenge on Bush's plate was one even he couldn't bomb his way out of. While George H.W. Bush was basking in the glow of his Gulf War victory, back home, the economic landscape was starting to look like a stormy day in August. The early 1990s recession was hitting hard, and Bush was about to face a major test. Remember Bush's campaign promise of no new taxes? It was like promising to eat only dessert for dinner. Sounds great in theory, but eventually you have to face the vegetables. In 1990, facing a growing deficit and mounting pressure, Bush had to make a tough choice. He agreed to raise taxes as part of a budget deal with Congress, breaking his famous pledge in the process. Imagine the political fallout, like promising your kids no bedtime and then having to enforce it. The backlash was intense, and his approval ratings took a hit. It was as if he'd gone from national hero to public enemy #1 overnight. The economy was tough, with high unemployment and sluggish growth. It was a rough ride for many Americans, and Bush was left trying to navigate through these turbulent waters while defending his policies. And as if that wasn't enough, the 1992 presidential election was looming. Bush's economic troubles were becoming a major talking point for his opponents, and the once uncheckable approval ratings were starting to crumble. Add to that the rise of Ross Perot as a third-party candidate, sort of like an unexpected plot twist in a soap opera, and Bush was facing an uphill battle. Perot's candidacy took a chunk out of Bush's support, making the 1992 election more of a cliffhanger than anyone anticipated. In the end, Bush lost the 1992 election to Bill Clinton, a defeat that was a bitter pill to swallow after such a triumphant start. The economy and the broken tax pledge had created a storm that even the Gulf War victory couldn't weather. Though George H.W. Bush's presidency had its ups and downs, there were key moments that shaped the future of the nation and even the world. Two of his lasting legacies were the groundwork for NAFTA and the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Bush had a vision for economic cooperation, and in 1992, he laid the foundation for what would become the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This groundbreaking deal was all about opening up trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Some loved it, some, well, not so much, but there's no denying it reshaped how we do business across the continent. Think of it as Bush's way of saying, hey neighbors, let's share the pie. Of course, it wasn't always a smooth negotiation process, but Bush helped get the wheels turning, and NAFTA would later be signed by his successor, Bill Clinton. But perhaps Bush's most heartfelt legacy was the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, which he signed into law in 1990. This law was a game changer for millions of Americans. ensuring equal rights and access for people with disabilities in everything from employment to public services. It was one of the most significant pieces of civil rights legislation since the 1960s, and Bush championed it with full force. He said, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down," and that's exactly what happened. Bush's legacy wasn't just about wars and diplomacy, it was about creating a more inclusive America. While NAFTA was shaping the future of trade, the ADA was shaping the future of equality at home. Not a bad legacy for a guy who also had to juggle a recession, right? George H.W. Bush's time in office may have ended with economic struggles, but his impact on both international trade and civil rights continues to resonate today. Whether it was expanding global markets or opening doors for Americans with disabilities, Bush left a mark that reached far beyond his 4 years in office. George H.W. Bush may have only served one term, but his impact on the United States and the world is undeniable. From the fall of the Berlin Wall to Operation Desert Storm, from laying the groundwork for NAFTA to championing the rights of people with disabilities, Bush's presidency was filled with landmark moments. Bush was often called a gentleman president, someone who believed in the power of diplomacy, honor, and, above all, service. His leadership during the Cold War's final days helped bring peace without firing a single shot, a feat few could have predicted. And while he may have struggled with the economy and the infamous no new taxes pledge, Bush's commitment to America never wavered. His presidency was about more than politics, it was about setting the stage for the future. In fact, Bush's call for a kinder, gentler nation was a far cry from the fierce battles he fought in politics. But, in a way, it showed who he really was, a man who valued unity, service, and doing what was right, even if it wasn't always popular. Bush passed away in 2018, leaving behind a legacy of service, courage, and a profound sense of duty. He was a war hero, a statesman, a president, and a father to one of America's future presidents. His impact wasn't just in what he accomplished during his presidency, but in how he carried himself with grace and dignity through the highs and the lows. So, while George H.W. Bush's presidency might be remembered for big events like the Gulf War and the end of the Cold War, his true legacy is about the values he stood for. The world he helped shape, the rights he fought to protect, and the example he set for future generations.